You probably don't think about the Egyptian timeline very much. It's a straight line in the back of a textbook, a few neat dates in a documentary. Pharaohs, Old Kingdom, pyramids, 3,000 years of civilization and decline. But what if that line is less like a discovered truth and more like a story we kept editing until it stopped bothering us? Tonight we're going to walk along the spine of that story and tug on every place it's been stitched together. The king lists that talk about tens of thousands of years we quietly delete. The evidence connecting pharaohs to pyramids is thinner than you'd think. The questions were dismissed before they were fully asked. By the end, you'll see the timeline isn't built on evidence. It's built on choices about which evidence to believe and which to bury under Zahi Hawass's watch. Share your thoughts and doubts in the comments before we move deeper into this investigation. There is a papyrus that sits in a museum in Turin. On one side, tax records from ancient Egypt. On the other, something far more interesting, a complete list of Egyptian rulers stretching back through time. The list starts with gods, moves through demigods, and gradually transitions to human pharaohs we recognize from textbooks. There are no section breaks, no labels distinguishing mythology from history. Just one continuous record written in the same careful script throughout. At the bottom, a summary. Venerables, the Shemsu-Hor, 13,420 years. Reigns before the Shemsu-Hor, 23,200 years. Total, 36,620 years. And this is the Turin King list, one of the most important sources for Egyptian chronology. Egyptologists cite it constantly in their research, using it to establish dates for dynasties and pharaohs, but they only use part of it. The last 3,000 years with recognizable names like Khufu and Ramesses get treated as history. The first 33,000 years get labeled as mythology. If you look up the Turin Papyrus on Wikipedia, you'll find this telling phrase. The papyrus lists rulers of Egypt, including mythical kings such as gods, demigods, and spirits, as well as human kings. Read that again. Mythical kings such as gods, as if the ancient scribe who wrote this made that distinction himself. As if there were two separate columns, one for real kings and one for made-up ones. But the Egyptians never drew that line themselves. It's one continuous list, compiled with the same precision throughout. The scribe treated the gods who ruled during Zep-Tepi the first time with exactly the same historical legitimacy as pharaohs whose tombs we've excavated and whose mummies we've studied. The Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, were not marvel characters or legends tossed around a campfire, but part of a continuous chain of authority. You worship your god, you obey your king, and you stand in the long shadow of rulers who came before. When scholars in the 19th century first began deciphering hieroglyphs, they were working under pressures we barely think about now. They weren't just reconstructing Egypt, they were trying to reconcile it with other stories. The Bible, classical writers like Herodotus, the chronologies of Manetho that arrived through Greek and Roman filters, already distorted by centuries of translation and commentary. Everyone needed a neat beginning, a date that made sense within the framework of world history as it was understood in Victorian lecture halls, a point where civilization appears on stage, right on cue, not too early, not impossibly old. So they negotiated and made editorial decisions. The divine kings and impossible reign lengths from the papyri and king lists were treated as allegory, political theology, or outright confusion on the part of ancient scribes. The human kings with shorter, more plausible reigns were absorbed into a workable timeline. The line in the sand went roughly around 3000 BC, give or take a few centuries. Anything that didn't cooperate with that line was exiled into the realm of mythic prehistory. This pattern of dismissing inconvenient timelines isn't unique to Egypt. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology operated under a paradigm called Clovis First. Named after distinctive spear points found at sites dating to approximately 13,000 years ago, this became the accepted answer to when humans first arrived in the Americas. This wasn't just a theory, it was treated as established fact, defended with the kind of certainty that doesn't invite questions. When researchers found evidence suggesting earlier dates, stone tools in Brazil that seemed 20,000 years old, occupation sites in Chile dating to 15,000 years, the finds were dismissed. The dating must be wrong. The tools must have moved from later layers through natural processes. The evidence must be contaminated. Any explanation was preferable to accepting that humans might have been in the Americas before the Clovis horizon, because that would require abandoning the theoretical framework everyone had agreed upon. For decades, evidence was rejected because it contradicted the paradigm. Researchers who presented pre-Clovis findings found their papers dismissed, their conference presentations marginalized, their careers stalling. The barrier held until evidence became too overwhelming to ignore at White Sands, New Mexico. In September 2021, the journal Science published a groundbreaking study. Human footprints preserved in ancient lake sediments, dated by multiple independent methods to approximately 23,000 years ago, 10,000 years before humans were allowed to be there. The paradigm collapsed essentially overnight. The ice-free corridor theory was abandoned. The entire narrative had to be reconceived. So, when Egyptologists cross out 36,000 years of Egyptian records and call it mythology, maybe we should ask, what if they're making the same mistake? The Turin Papyrus isn't the only Egyptian record mentioning these earlier periods. The Abydos King List records similar vast spans of history. Temple inscriptions reference them. Ptolemaic period texts cite older sources now lost. They all tell the same story. Before the dynasties, before Narmer unified Egypt around 3100 BC, there were others. The Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who ruled for over 13,000 years according to the records. Before them came Zep-Tepi, when gods themselves governed, when the foundations of Egyptian civilization were established. 23,000 years, the records say, when knowledge of architecture, astronomy, medicine and mathematics was given to humanity. Nearly 40,000 years of continuous history recorded the same way Egyptians recorded everything else they considered worth preserving. The Egyptians understood the difference between historical records and mythological narratives. We have examples of both, and the stylistic contrast is stark. Take a text like The Contendings of Horus and Seth. It is rich with dialogue, magical battles, and dramatic narrative arcs clearly written as a legend. The Turin King List has none of these flourishes. It is a dry, administrative record of succession, compiled because knowing who ruled and for how long mattered for establishing legitimacy. Modern Egyptologists kept the last 3,000 years and discarded the rest. Their reasoning makes sense from one perspective. 36,000 years of pre-dynastic civilization doesn't fit with anything else we think we know about human development. It pushes complex society back to a time when humans were supposed to be living in small bands, just beginning to experiment with cultivation. Accepting the Egyptian timeline would require rethinking not just Egyptian history, but the entire story of human civilization. So the earlier sections became mythology, stories the Egyptians told to give their culture weight and antiquity. Of course, there are problems with taking these ancient timelines literally. The numbers in the king lists are messy, fragments are missing, and some reign lengths are clearly symbolic or exaggerated for religious purposes. No serious person wants to throw away radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy to chase after legends. But to watch how the discussion is framed in academic circles. They don't say, the Egyptians believed they had a 36,000-year history before our documented period. We're not sure how to interpret that, but it's worth taking seriously as part of their worldview, and maybe as a garbled memory of something real. Instead, they say, the Egyptians had myths of gods and demigods. Real history begins with the first dynasty. End of discussion. One editorial decision, one conceptual cut, and a whole age vanishes from consideration. The Egyptians gave us their history. They wrote it down, preserved it carefully, passed it through generations of scribes who considered accurate record-keeping sacred duty. We took that record, decided which parts to believe and which to dismiss, and built our version of Egyptian history on the edited remains. The question is whether we drew the line in the right place, or whether, like archaeologists, dismissing pre-Clovis footprints for decades. Walk into any major museum with an Egyptian collection, the Metropolitan in New York, the British Museum in London, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the Louvre in Paris. Spend an afternoon in the Egyptian galleries and pay attention not to the objects themselves, but to the small, printed cards that sit beside them, the placards that tell you what you're looking at and when it was made. Notice which numbers keep appearing. Dynasty 3, Dynasty 4. Over and over on nearly every piece that makes you stop and wonder how they did it. The massive granite statues with surfaces polished to a mirror finish. Dynasty 4. The precision-carved boxes with corners so perfect they seem machine-made. Dynasty 3 or 4. The columns weighing dozens of tons moved from quarries hundreds of miles away and erected with a precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. Old Kingdom, almost always Dynasty 4. The pattern holds whether you're looking at objects in storage or pieces on prominent display, whether you're examining famous artifacts or obscure fragments that only specialists study. The museum cards don't lie about this. They reflect the academic consensus, the collective agreement among Egyptologists about when these things were made and who made them. Ancient Egypt as a civilization lasted more than 3,000 years according to the conventional timeline. 31 separate dynasties ruled from the first unification under Narmer around 3100 BC until Cleopatra's death in 30 BC and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman Empire. That's a span of time longer than the entire history of Christianity, longer than the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, longer than most modern nations have existed. During those 3 millennia, Egypt saw periods of prosperity and collapse, foreign invasion and reconquest, religious revolution and artistic renaissance. The civilization evolved, adapted, survived catastrophic climate changes and political upheavals that destroyed other cultures. And yet, when you look at the objects that represent the absolute peak of Egyptian technical achievement, they are almost all attributed to the same 200-year window at the very beginning. This isn't a minor oddity or an interesting footnote. It's a fundamental contradiction in how we understand the development of civilizations. Technology doesn't work this way. Skills don't appear fully formed, remain at an absolute peak for a brief period, then vanish for millennia. Every other civilization we can study shows a gradual progression. Simple techniques develop into more complex ones. Early failures lead to refined methods. Knowledge accumulates across generations, building on what came before. The Romans didn't start with the Pantheon and then forget how to build domes. The Greeks didn't begin with the Parthenon and then lose the ability to carve marble. Medieval Europe didn't construct Chartres Cathedral in the 12th century and then spend the next 500 years unable to match it. But that's exactly the pattern Egypt supposedly followed. The third dynasty, according to mainstream Egyptology, marked the beginning of the Old Kingdom around 2686 BC. Before this, Egypt had gone through the early dynastic period, a couple of centuries, when the newly unified kingdom was establishing itself, building relatively simple mud brick structures. Then suddenly the step pyramid of Giza at Saqqara. Not just a tomb, but an entire complex of precision stonework, underground chambers, and architectural innovations that had never been attempted before. The fourth dynasty followed, and this is where things get truly strange. Starting around 2613 BC with Sneferu, we get an explosion of pyramid building that has never been matched. Sneferu himself is credited with constructing 3 massive pyramids, the one at Meidum, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid at Dashur. These aren't small structures. Each one represents millions of tons of stone, carefully quarried, transported, and assembled. The Red Pyramid's internal chambers feature corbelled ceilings reaching high into the structure, built with massive limestone blocks fitted with precision that leaves modern visitors stunned. Then came Khufu and the Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest and most precisely constructed pyramid Egypt would ever produce. His successors Khafra and Menkaura added the second and third Giza pyramids, along with the massive megalithic temples and the Sphinx. After Menkaura, around 2510 BC, the age of the mega-pyramids ended. Other pyramids were built in later periods, certainly. Egypt continued to honor its pharaohs with pyramid tombs for centuries, but none of them came close to matching the size, precision, or technical sophistication of those Fourth Dynasty monuments. The pyramids of the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties were smaller, built with inferior techniques, and many have collapsed into ruins barely recognizable as pyramids at all. By the Middle Kingdom, over 1,000 years later, Egypt was still building pyramids but using mud brick cores that eroded quickly, leaving little behind except the granite and limestone casing stones that once covered them. The same pattern appears in the precision granite work. The Old Kingdom sites, particularly those from dynasties 3 and 4, feature granite boxes, door frames, and architectural elements carved and fitted with a level of precision that suggests advanced tools and techniques we don't fully understand. These aren't decorative pieces, they're functional components, often weighing many tons, placed deep inside pyramids or in underground chambers where no one was meant to see them. The surfaces are flat to within fractions of a millimeter. The corners are square to tolerances that would satisfy modern machinists. The granite used is some of the hardest stone available, requiring either extremely hard tools or techniques that don't leave the kind of marks we'd expect from bronze chisels and copper saws. Later dynasties tried to match this work and failed. The granite elements they produced show tool marks, irregularities, surfaces that are flattish but not truly precise. You can see the difference with your own eyes if you visit Egypt and examine both Old Kingdom and later work in the same day. The later pieces are impressive, certainly representing considerable skill and effort. But they're not the same. Something was lost between the Fourth Dynasty and everything that came after. The conventional explanation for this is that the Old Kingdom represented a unique moment of social organization and resource mobilization. Egypt had recently unified, the argument goes, and the early pharaohs commanded absolute authority and enormous labor forces that could be directed toward massive building projects. The Pyramid Age ended, according to this view, not because the knowledge was lost, but because later periods had different priorities, different religious practices, different ways of expressing royal power. But this explanation requires us to believe that capability and knowledge once achieved simply sat unused for millennia. That's not how civilizations work with valuable skills. Knowledge that solves real problems gets used, refined, passed on. If the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty truly possessed techniques for achieving such remarkable precision in stonework, why would their descendants not use those same techniques in later periods when they were building temples and monuments meant to last for eternity? All the genius, all the technical mastery, all the inexplicable precision in working the hardest materials concentrated in 2 dynasties, spanning perhaps 4 generations of a single family. And then, for the next 2,800 years, nothing that comes close. The same civilization, the same locations, the same basic tools and materials according to the orthodox view, but never again achieving what was supposedly accomplished at the very start. The museum cards tell this story without meaning to. We stop questioning why all the most remarkable achievements cluster in such a narrow slice of time. We accept it because the experts have told us that's when these things were made, and the experts must know. But if we're honest about what the evidence shows, rather than what we expect it to show, we have to ask whether those 2 dynasties really did achieve all of this, or whether they inherited capabilities from something that came before, capabilities they tried to maintain and imitate, but ultimately couldn't recreate. Let's take a closer look at the monumental works of these 2 dynasties to understand how Egyptologists assign dates to them. The most iconic example is the Great Pyramid of Giza, attributed to Khufu, a pharaoh of the 4th dynasty who ruled Egypt sometime around 2580 BC, according to conventional chronology. It's taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, and accepted as one of those facts everyone simply knows. Except when you examine what actually connects Khufu to this monument, the evidence becomes surprisingly problematic. The most direct physical evidence cited for Khufu's involvement consists of red ochre markings found in small chambers above the king's chamber. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls, including what appears to be Khufu's name, enclosed in a cartouche. This were discovered in 1837, when British explorer Howard Vyse forced his way up through the granite ceiling of the king's chamber. These inscriptions became the primary evidence connecting Khufu to the Great Pyramid, the proof that's cited whenever anyone questions the attribution. The problem is that these markings have never been scientifically tested to verify their age. Paint contains organic binders that can be carbon dated. A small sample, carefully extracted, could definitively establish whether the inscriptions date to the 4th dynasty as claimed, or to the 19th century when Vyse discovered them. The technology exists and has existed for decades. The method is well established. The sample required would be tiny, causing no visible damage to the inscriptions. Yet requests to perform such testing have been consistently denied by Egyptian authorities, most notably during Zahi Hawass's decades-long control of access to the sites. Why refuse testing that could settle the question? If the inscriptions are authentic 4th dynasty work, chemical analysis would prove it conclusively and silence all skeptics. The refusal to test suggests awareness that results might not support the narrative, that definitive evidence could undermine rather than confirm the conventional attribution. Beyond the untested graffiti, there's another category of evidence that's even more revealing about how the timeline gets enforced through selective interpretation. In the 1980s and 1990s, a more comprehensive carbon dating project was undertaken. Funded by David H. Koch and led by researchers including Mark Lehner, this project aimed to settle questions about pyramid dating by testing organic material from mortar samples taken from multiple pyramids, including the Great Pyramid. Mortar, used in ancient construction, typically contains organic materials like straw or reeds that can be carbon dated, potentially providing direct evidence about when the structures were built. The results from this extensive testing program revealed something fascinating. The dates didn't cluster neatly around the 4th dynasty as expected. Instead, they ranged widely, with some samples dating 400 years older than Khufu's reign and others dating 400 years younger. Rather than providing clear confirmation of the conventional chronology, the carbon dating revealed an 800-year spread in dates from what should have been contemporary construction, if the orthodox timeline were accurate. The methodology used to interpret these contradictory results reveals how evidence gets forced to fit predetermined conclusions. Samples that dated close to the expected 4th dynasty period were labeled reliable. Samples that dated significantly older or younger than expected were classified as contaminated and excluded from final analysis. The researchers then averaged the remaining reliable samples to produce a mean date that, conveniently, fell close to the 4th dynasty. But let's set aside the methodological problems for a moment and assume the carbon dating results are genuinely accurate. Even then, this method has sometimes misidentified the true age of certain sites around the world. At Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in human history, archaeologists initially found pottery and collapsed walls that carbon dated to approximately 1550 BC. This was interpreted as a well-documented Bronze Age destruction, aligning neatly with historical accounts of regional conflict. The dating seemed straightforward. The site was catalogued, the conclusions published, and the chronology accepted. Then deeper excavation revealed something unexpected beneath those Bronze Age remains. Massive stone walls, towers, defensive fortifications that carbon dated to roughly 8,000 BC. Neolithic construction, 10,000 years old, buried under 6,000 years of later occupation. The Bronze Age people who lived at Jericho in 1550 BC had built their settlement directly on top of walls that were already ancient when they arrived. The earlier carbon dating of the upper levels had been perfectly accurate. It correctly dated the Bronze Age layer. But it revealed nothing about the far older structures underneath, because no one had tested them yet. No one knew they were there until excavation went deeper than the visible surface remains. The Great Pyramid presents a parallel problem. The carbon dating project tested mortar samples from courses visible on the exterior and from accessible interior passages. These are the layers researchers could reach, the material available for sampling. But ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Giza over the past several decades have detected anomalies beneath the plateau, chambers, passages, structures that conventional pyramid theory doesn't account for. These findings have been documented in technical reports, noted in specialist literature, confirmed by multiple independent surveys using different technologies. The anomalies are real. Something is down there. What if those underground features are older than the pyramid we can see? What if they could reveal the true age of the Great Pyramid, as was the case at Jericho? Carbon dating is a powerful and reliable tool when properly applied, but it only tells you about what you actually test. If you exclusively test accessible surface layers and later repairs, while systematically blocking investigation of deeper, potentially older elements, you get an incomplete picture. The ancient Egyptians themselves left no clear claim that Khufu built the Great Pyramid. The attribution comes from modern Egyptology's need to assign major monuments to specific pharaohs to maintain the chronological framework the discipline is built upon. If the Great Pyramid can't be confidently attributed to Khufu, if the evidence suggests it might be older than his reign or built by someone else entirely, then the entire 4th dynasty timeline becomes questionable. And if the 4th dynasty timeline is questionable, the chronology of Egyptian civilization that depends on it starts to collapse. The physical evidence linking the Great Pyramid to Khufu's timeline is becoming more tenuous than ever. Graffiti that won't be tested, carbon samples cherry-picked to fit, deeper structures kept off limits. This is a timeline being assembled piece by piece. Test what fits, dismiss what doesn't, bury what contradicts, block what might prove inconvenient. The result isn't history, it's construction, built as carefully as the pyramids themselves, but from selected data rather than limestone blocks. Let's step back to the site that supposedly marks the very beginning of pyramid building. At Saqqara, the step pyramid looks primitive compared to the smooth-sided giants at Giza. It rises in 6 distinct tiers, each layer smaller than the one below, creating a massive staircase climbing toward the sky. Djoser's architect Imhotep gets credit for this innovation, transforming the traditional flat-roofed mastaba tomb into something grander by stacking progressively smaller mastabas on top of each other. The structure that resulted looks crude from the outside, almost experimental, as if the builders were still figuring out how to work with stone on this scale. It's the kind of monument you'd expect from the beginning of a technological development curve, before the knowledge and skills had been refined through experience. That's what you see from ground level, but beneath the step pyramid, hidden from almost everyone who visits Saqqara, there's something that contradicts everything the pyramid's exterior suggests about the builder's capabilities. Getting down to it requires descending through levels of ancient construction, moving deeper into spaces that feel increasingly disconnected from the world above. The modern scaffolding and ventilation equipment tell you this isn't a normal tourist route. The air changes as you go down, becoming cooler and somehow heavier, carrying that particular stillness that comes from spaces sealed away from sunlight for thousands of years. 4 levels down, you reach a chamber that shouldn't exist if the conventional story about Djoser and the step pyramid were accurate. The space rises 28 meters from floor to ceiling, roughly 90 feet of vertical height, carved out of bedrock and finished with precision stonework. Standing at the bottom and looking up, the scale becomes disorienting. This isn't a small burial chamber or a modest storage room. It's a cathedral-sized space created underground through methods that remain unexplained. The scaffolding installed by modern researchers extends upward into dimness, giving some sense of the chamber's true height, but even with artificial lighting, the ceiling disappears into shadow above. In the center of this enormous chamber sits a granite box. Not a small container, but a structure built from 32 separate blocks of granite, most weighing around 3 tons, though some exceed 10 tons. The blocks have been fitted together with the kind of precision that characterizes the finest megalithic work anywhere in Egypt. No mortar holds them in place. The blocks simply rest against each other, their surfaces ground and polished so flat that they create joints tight enough to resist the passage of time without any adhesive. The walls of this granite structure rise roughly 15 feet, creating an enclosed space within the larger chamber, though no roof appears to have ever covered the top. The truly puzzling aspect isn't just that this granite chamber exists, but when it must have been constructed. The chamber sits 4 levels down, deep in bedrock beneath the step pyramid's foundation. The pyramid couldn't have been built first and then somehow had this chamber inserted underneath. That's physically impossible. The chamber, the shaft leading down to it, the carved bedrock spaces surrounding it, all of this had to be completed before the first stone of the step pyramid was laid above. The sequence is inescapable. First, quarry down into bedrock, creating vertical shafts and horizontal chambers. Second, build the precision granite structure at the bottom. Third, construct the pyramid on top of the whole complex. This means the most technically sophisticated element of the entire Djoser complex, the part requiring the greatest precision and the most advanced stoneworking capability, came first in the construction sequence. That sequence contradicts how technological development works. The deepest, oldest element demonstrates capabilities that the visible pyramid above doesn't match. It's as if whoever built the granite chamber possessed knowledge and skills that were then somehow degraded or lost by the time the pyramid itself was constructed. Consider what would have been required to create this chamber. First, excavate 28 meters down through solid limestone bedrock. Not a simple vertical shaft, but a space large enough to work in, with room for the workers and their tools and the massive granite blocks that would eventually line the chamber. The excavation itself represents a tremendous amount of labor, removing thousands of tons of solid rock through the slow process of pounding with stone tools and prying out loosened chunks. Modern mining operations use hydraulic equipment and explosives to break rock. Ancient workers had neither, relying instead on patient application of force, using the hardest stones they could find as hammers and wedges. Once the chamber space existed, the granite blocks had to be moved into position. Each 3 to 10 ton block had to be lowered down the shaft, maneuvered through the underground passages, and set precisely in its designated location. The blocks fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch, despite their enormous weight and the awkward underground working conditions. No visible tool marks mar the polished surfaces, no obvious wedge holes or lever points show how the blocks were positioned. The joints between blocks run perfectly straight, the corners meet at exact 90-degree angles. The whole structure demonstrates a level of precision that seems incompatible with the confined space and limited light that the workers must have endured during construction. The conventional explanation would be that Imhotep, Djoser's famous architect, designed both the underground chamber and the pyramid above as parts of a unified funerary complex. The underground work came first as a natural consequence of construction sequencing, but it was all planned together and executed by the same workforce using the same tools and techniques. This explanation requires us to believe that the builders possessed extraordinary precision stoneworking skills when they carved and fitted the granite chamber, then somehow forgot or abandoned those same skills when they built the cruder limestone pyramid on top. It requires accepting that the quality of work degraded dramatically within the same construction project, supposedly under the direction of the same architect. Most people who visit Saqqara never see this chamber. The site is famous, drawing tourists from around the world who come to photograph the step pyramid and explore the surface-level temples and causeways. But access to the deep underground structures is restricted. You need special permission, official escorts, sometimes the right connections with Egyptian authorities who control who gets to see what. The chamber isn't included in standard tourist routes. No signs point the way to it. Most guidebooks don't mention it exists. The evidence sits beneath the desert, waiting for anyone willing to look at it without the filtering lens of conventional chronology. The chamber is real. The precision is measurable. The sequence of construction is clear. What remains unclear is when this chamber was actually built, by whom, and for what purpose. The current explanations require accepting contradictions and impossibilities, because the alternative, that our timeline for Egyptian civilization might be fundamentally wrong, would mean rethinking too many established positions. So the chamber stays hidden, the questions go unasked by official sources, and tourists walk over one of the most significant pieces of evidence for advanced ancient capabilities without ever knowing it's there. The pattern visible at Saqqara isn't unique. At Meidum, about 60 miles south of Cairo, where Sneferu's collapsed pyramid rises from the desert, sits a structure that looks completely unremarkable from the outside. Mastaba 17 appears as a long mound of mud brick, stretching over 100 meters across the sand. Sun-baked clay shaped by hand and stacked into walls, the most primitive building material available to ancient Egyptians. From the surface, there's nothing about this mud heap that would make you look twice. It's exactly what you'd expect from early tomb construction before the Egyptians supposedly mastered working with stone. Flinders Petrie, one of the pioneers who established Egyptology as a scientific discipline in the late 1800s, surveyed Meidum extensively. He documented the pyramid, measured surrounding structures, made detailed notes about everything he observed. Petrie wasn't someone who missed details. His meticulous methods set standards researchers still follow today. But Mastaba 17 didn't interest him beyond its surface features. A mud brick tomb was unremarkable, one of many similar structures scattered across Egyptian sites. He noted its existence, recorded its unusually precise alignment to the cardinal directions, and moved on to more promising areas. For 19 years, Petrie worked at sites across Egypt, returning to Meidum periodically, but never thinking to look beneath that mud brick mastaba. 19 years of walking past it, never suspecting what lay hidden below. Eventually, something made him reconsider. Perhaps the mastaba's precise alignment despite being built from such crude materials. Perhaps its size and the effort required to construct it. Whatever the reason, Petrie finally decided to excavate beneath the mud brick, using what appeared to be an ancient robber's tunnel for access. What he found shouldn't have been there, according to everything the mastaba's exterior suggested. Beneath the crude mud brick, down through meters of fill and bedrock, was a chamber built from massive granite blocks. The contrast was absolute. Above ground, sun-baked mud shaped by hand. Below ground, granite quarried from deposits hundreds of miles away, shaped to exact dimensions, fitted together with joints measured in fractions of an inch. The chamber's walls showed the same expert stone fitting visible in the finest megalithic work anywhere in Egypt. Individual blocks curved around corners with surfaces ground so precisely that joints remained almost invisible. No mortar held them in place. The blocks simply rested against each other, their precision creating a structure that had survived thousands of years without any adhesive. These weren't small blocks, multi-ton pieces of one of the hardest stones available, each representing massive labor just to quarry and transport, let alone shape to such standards. The surfaces were polished smooth, the corners met at exact 90-degree angles. The whole structure demonstrated precision that would satisfy modern machinists. Inside sat a granite sarcophagus, a single massive block carved with the same precision and polished to an equally fine finish. Petrie found it with its lid pried open, evidence that ancient tomb robbers had reached this space. Inside were mummified remains, which conventional interpretation took as proof this was a tomb serving the funerary purpose the mud brick mastaba above suggested. But finding a mummy in a precisely carved stone box doesn't mean the box was originally made as a coffin. It might simply mean that at some point, perhaps long after the chamber and box were created, someone found this impressive underground space and decided it was appropriate for burial. The Egyptians had a tradition of reusing older tombs and monuments, particularly when those structures demonstrated grandeur or sophistication that later periods couldn't match. Later burial in an earlier structure tells us the structure existed and was considered significant. It doesn't tell us when the structure was originally built or for what purpose. The mud brick mastaba represents one level of capability: basic, crude, functional, but unsophisticated. The granite chamber represents something entirely different. Precision stone, working requiring tools and techniques the mud brick builders apparently didn't possess. The disconnect between these elements is complete. After 19 years examining Egyptian construction methods better than almost anyone of his era, Petrie looked at this contradiction and wrote something remarkable. He stated that the relationship between the granite chamber and the mud brick mastaba seemed so disconnected that it was as if there was never any communication between the builders of the chamber and the builders of the mastaba. Not built at different times by the same culture, not different construction phases, no communication between builders. These are carefully chosen words from someone who didn't make casual statements about evidence. Petrie was saying these builders might as well have been from different worlds for all the connection their methods showed. One group possessed sophisticated stoneworking capabilities, knowledge to quarry and transport multi-ton granite from hundreds of miles away, skills to shape and fit them precisely, patience to polish hard stone to mirror finishes. The other group worked with sun-dried mud brick shaped by hand and left to harden in the sun. The conventional explanation argues this represents different phases of the same project. Granite chamber first as the burial space, mud brick mastaba later as the visible monument. But this requires accepting that the same culture used wildly different construction methods within the same project. That builders who could work granite to precise tolerances then chose primitive mud brick for the visible portion everyone would see. The alternative explanation is simpler: two different groups of builders separated not just by years, but by capabilities suggesting far greater distance. The granite chamber might have already existed, already been ancient, when 3rd or 4th dynasty Egyptians found it. They recognized it as significant, built a mastaba over it using methods they knew, honored it with a monument in their own style. They couldn't recreate the precision granite work, but they could mark and preserve what they'd found. This is exactly what you'd expect if later civilizations were building on top of work from predecessors whose capabilities they couldn't fully replicate. The mastaba at Meidum still sits beneath the desert sun, its mud brick slowly eroding, while the granite chamber beneath remains as precise as the day it was completed. The chamber waits in darkness, its polished surfaces and impossible precision contradicting the primitive structure above. Petrie's observation from over a century ago remains as relevant today as when he first wrote it. There was no communication between these builders because they weren't contemporaries working on the same project. They were separated by something far more significant than the few decades conventional chronology allows. But even if we accept every questionable piece of evidence, we still face a more fundamental problem: the impossible mathematics of pyramids construction. Numbers don't lie the way narratives can. You can construct elaborate theories, build compelling arguments, appeal to academic authority and scholarly consensus, but mathematics remains stubbornly indifferent to all of it. The numbers either work or they don't. When you apply basic arithmetic to the conventional timeline for building the pyramids, something remarkable happens. The story that gets told in museums and documentaries, the story we've all accepted as established history, collapses under the weight of simple calculation. Let's start at the beginning with the man Egyptologists credit as the father of pyramid building on a truly massive scale. Sneferu ruled Egypt as the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, sometime around 2613 BC, according to the conventional chronology. He was Khufu's father, and by all accounts a successful and long-lived king who reigned anywhere from 24 to 48 years, depending on which fragmentary records you trust. During this reign, Sneferu supposedly built not one but 3 of the largest pyramids Egypt would ever see. The first is the pyramid at Meidum, located about 60 miles south of Cairo. This structure originally rose as a true pyramid with smooth sloping sides before its outer casing collapsed at some point in history, leaving the strange, stepped core we see today jutting from a mound of debris. Before this collapse, the Meidum pyramid would have been nearly identical in form to the Great Pyramid of Giza, sharing the same distinctive slope angle of 51 degrees. Egyptologists debate whether Sneferu began this pyramid or merely completed work started by his predecessor Huni, but either way, the conventional timeline credits Sneferu with finishing a massive pyramid and its associated complex of temples and causeways. Then came the bent pyramid at Dashur, one of the most visually distinctive pyramids in Egypt because of its unusual profile. The lower section rises at a steep angle before abruptly changing to a shallower slope about halfway up, creating the bent appearance that gives the structure its name. The conventional explanation is that the builders started at too steep an angle, noticed structural problems, and adjusted the slope to reduce the weight on the base. Whether or not this explanation holds, the bent pyramid represents an enormous construction project. The internal chambers and passages are remarkably complex, featuring multiple entrance points and a sophisticated system of corbelled ceilings that demonstrate advanced understanding of structural engineering. This wasn't a simple pile of stone, but a carefully engineered structure requiring extensive planning and skilled execution. The third pyramid Sneferu built at Dahshur is called the Red Pyramid because of the reddish limestone used in its construction. This is the third largest pyramid in Egypt after Khufu's and Khafra's monuments at Giza. The corbelled ceilings in these chambers rise to tremendous heights, each stone course carefully cantilevered inward until the ceiling closes at the top. The blocks used in these chambers aren't small. Some of them are truly massive, positioned high above ground level with precision that's difficult to achieve even with modern lifting equipment. Stand inside these chambers and the scale of the accomplishment becomes visceral in a way that photographs can't capture. These weren't the only projects attributed to Sneferu's reign. There are satellite pyramids at both Dahshur sites, smaller structures that still represent significant construction efforts. There are extensive temple complexes, causeways connecting different elements of each pyramid site, and all the infrastructure required to support such massive building programs. And throughout all of this, Sneferu had to actually run a kingdom. He wasn't just a construction manager. He was pharaoh of all Egypt, responsible for maintaining order, administering justice, conducting religious ceremonies, managing the economy, and defending the borders. Historical records mention military campaigns Sneferu conducted against Nubia and Libya, expeditions that would have required months away from the capital, leading armies into foreign territory. So here's the arithmetic problem. The conventional timeline asks us to believe that while Sneferu was conquering foreign lands, performing religious duties, managing an empire, he also directed the quarrying, transport, and precise placement of millions of tons of stone across 3 separate major construction sites, not over generations, not by different pharaohs who each added their contribution. One man in one lifetime, creating more pyramid volume than any other ruler before or after. Modern construction projects provide useful context for evaluating these claims. The Panama Canal took 33 years from initial construction attempts in 1881 to completion in 1914. Roughly 75,000 people worked on this project at its peak, using steam-powered equipment, industrial explosives, and modern medical care to combat tropical diseases. The canal certainly represents an impressive achievement, but its scale isn't dramatically larger than moving and placing the stone volume in Sneferu's 3 pyramids. Yet it took a third of a century with industrial-age technology, while Sneferu supposedly accomplished comparable work in less time using Bronze Age methods. The mathematics here should give anyone pause, but it gets more interesting when you look at what happened next. Sneferu's son Khufu inherited the throne around 2589 BC and apparently decided that 3 pyramids weren't enough. He wanted one bigger than all of his fathers combined, and he wanted it built to tolerances that would make modern precision engineers uncomfortable. The Great Pyramid at Giza became not just the largest pyramid ever constructed, but also the most precisely built, with features that suggest capabilities far beyond what Bronze Age tools should allow. Start with what we can measure directly. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.5 million limestone blocks. This number is an estimate because we can't dismantle the pyramid to count them, but it's based on the structure's known volume and the average size of the blocks we can observe. These blocks aren't uniform. Some weigh as little as 2 tons, roughly the weight of a large automobile. Others exceed 15 tons. The average mass falls somewhere around 2.5 tons per block. Moving a single one of these blocks from quarry to final position represents a significant undertaking, even with modern forklifts and cranes. The pyramid contains 2.5 million of them. According to mainstream Egyptology, Khufu reigned for approximately 23 years, though some sources stretch this to 27 years. Let's use the longer estimate to be generous. 27 years equals roughly 9,855 days. Divide 2.5 million blocks by 9,855 days and you need to quarry, transport, shape, and precisely position about 254 blocks every single day for 27 years straight without pause. Every day for nearly 3 decades. Including the days when Khufu was sick, when religious festivals prohibited work, when tools broke and needed replacing, when workers needed rest, when seasonal flooding made certain operations impossible. But the work couldn't happen every single day. People need rest. Tools need maintenance and replacement. Weather interferes with outdoor work. Religious festivals required ting gong. Seasonal flooding of the Nile would have halted certain operations entirely, particularly the transportation of granite from quarries 600 miles to the south. Even assuming a work schedule that would be considered brutal by any modern standard, you're looking at perhaps 250 working days per year. Reduce the daily requirement accordingly, and you need to place about 365 blocks each working day. That's the average, the sustained rate that would need to be maintained year after year for the entire duration of the project. Divide a working day into hours and then minutes. If work proceeded from sunrise to sunset, roughly 12 hours in Egypt's latitude, you have 720 minutes of daylight. To place 365 blocks in 720 minutes means setting one block approximately every 2 minutes. But that's the average across 12 hours. In reality, work can't maintain perfect efficiency every minute of every hour. There are breaks, delays, problems that need solving, blocks that don't fit properly and need adjustment. A more realistic calculation accounting for the inefficiencies inherent in any large construction project suggests you'd need to successfully place a finished block roughly every 5 minutes, all day, every day, for 27 years straight, every 5 minutes. Think about what that means in practical terms. A crew quarries a 2.5-ton block from the limestone beds near Giza. Another crew shapes it to fit its precise position in the growing pyramid structure. A third crew transports it from quarry to pyramid, a distance that varied from a few hundred meters to several kilometers depending on which quarry was being worked. A fourth crew moves it up the pyramid face, lifting it over the courses already laid. A fifth crew sets it in place with precision, tight enough that you still can't fit a blade between the blocks in many sections. All of this coordinated activity involving hundreds or thousands of workers completed successfully every 5 minutes without pause, day after day, year after year. This calculation only accounts for the limestone blocks forming the pyramid's bulk. It doesn't include the massive granite beams in the king's chamber, each weighing up to 70 tons, transported from Aswan quarries over 600 miles away and lifted more than 100 feet above the pyramid's base, to be set with precision measured in fractions of an inch. It doesn't include the intricate internal passage system, carved through solid limestone with remarkable accuracy, some passages running perfectly straight for hundreds of feet. It doesn't include the subterranean chamber carved into bedrock 100 feet below the pyramid's base, accessed through a descending passage that maintains a consistent angle and width for its entire length. It doesn't account for the time required to survey and level the 13-acre site, removing irregular bedrock and creating a platform level to within fractions of an inch across its entire extent. The conventional timeline also doesn't account for design and planning. Complex engineering projects don't spontaneously happen. Someone had to conceive the pyramid's design, work out the mathematics ensuring it wouldn't collapse under its own weight, calculate the materials needed, plan the logistics of moving millions of tons of stone, coordinate the labor force, solve the thousands of technical problems that inevitably arise in any construction project. Modern engineering projects of far less complexity require years of planning before the first foundation is laid. The pyramid supposedly went from conception to completion within a single reign, with the design phase presumably eating into the already impossibly tight construction schedule. Consider what tools were available according to the standard archaeological timeline. The Fourth Dynasty falls within Egypt's Bronze Age, though many Egyptologists argue that the primary tools were still made from copper rather than true bronze. Copper is soft. It's excellent for electrical wiring and decorative work, but it doesn't hold an edge against hard stone. Strike limestone with a copper chisel, and the chisel deforms while the stone chips slightly. You can work limestone with copper tools through patience and persistence, using the copper more as an abrading tool than a cutting edge, but it's slow. Remarkably slow compared to what would be needed to maintain the pace the timeline requires. For the granite work, copper becomes almost useless. Granite is one of the hardest naturally occurring stones, a crystalline rock that dulls steel tools and requires diamond-tipped equipment for efficient cutting in modern quarries. The ancient Egyptians supposedly shaped granite using copper tools aided by quartz sand as an abrasive. The theory holds that by rubbing copper saws or drills against granite while feeding sand into the cut, the quartz particles would do the actual cutting. This process works in small-scale experiments, but it's extraordinarily slow. Modern recreations using these techniques have managed to cut through a few inches of granite after hours or days of sustained effort by skilled craftsmen working under ideal conditions. The Great Pyramid contains dozens of massive granite blocks, some carved with precision details like the box in the king's chamber or the granite plugs sealing the ascending passage. Achieving this level of work with copper and sand while maintaining the 5-minute per block pace seems beyond implausible. Transportation presents additional mathematical problems. Limestone blocks could theoretically be moved using wooden sledges pulled over wooden rollers or sleds dragged across sand made slippery with water, techniques depicted in some Egyptian tomb paintings. But granite had to come from Aswan, 600 miles away. Barges capable of carrying the 70-ton granite beams would have been massive structures requiring considerable crews to operate. The journey would have taken weeks in each direction, meaning only a limited number of trips could be made during the few months when the Nile flooded high enough to allow navigation of large barges all the way to Giza. Yet somehow the project maintained its relentless pace, never slowing down despite the logistical nightmare of coordinating deliveries of different stone types from different sources arriving at precisely the right times. The mathematics of the workforce present their own impossibilities. Various estimates suggest tens of thousands of workers would have been required, ranging from conservative figures of 20,000 to more extravagant claims of 100,000 or more. These workers needed food, water, shelter, tools, supervision, medical care. They needed to be organized into efficient crews, trained in specialized tasks, coordinated so that quarrying and transport and setting proceeded in synchronized fashion. Archaeological surveys of the Giza plateau have found evidence of workers' housing and support infrastructure, but nothing approaching the scale that would be needed to house and feed the workforce the mathematics require. In 2018, a scholar published a paper in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology attempting to address skepticism about Sneferu's building program. The paper acknowledged that many people find it implausible for one pharaoh to have built 3 giant pyramids in a single reign. The author's response to this skepticism is worth quoting directly. Contrary to widespread opinion, it was quite possible for Sneferu to build all 3 giant projects at Meidum and Dashur, if one can accept that Khufu completed his huge funerary complex in around 27 years. There is nothing to say that Sneferu could not complete his 3 pyramids in 40 years following a similar system of quarrying, transport, and installation of stone blocks. Read that argument carefully. The defense of Sneferu building 3 pyramids rests entirely on accepting that Khufu built 1 pyramid in 27 years, but we have no independent proof that Khufu actually accomplished this feat in that time frame. The evidence connecting Khufu to the Great Pyramid is questionable at best, as we've seen. The calculation showing 1 block every 5 minutes demonstrates that the claimed timeline is physically implausible with the tools supposedly available. So the argument becomes circular. Sneferu could do the impossible because Khufu did the impossible, and we know Khufu did the impossible because the timeline says he did, and we should accept the timeline because scholars have agreed on it. This is the kind of reasoning that would be laughed out of any other field of historical inquiry, but in Egyptology it passes for serious academic argument. The mathematics here are not ambiguous or subject to interpretation. They're straightforward calculations that anyone can verify with basic arithmetic. 1 block every 5 minutes for 27 years is a physically defined requirement, not an academic theory. The conventional timeline requires us to believe that 4th dynasty Egypt possessed capabilities far beyond what we attribute to them. Across Egypt, whenever a discovery threatens the accepted timeline, it is quietly contained, restricted, or buried. In 1900, Italian archaeologist Alessandro Barsanti began excavating a massive pit at Zawiet El Arian, a site roughly between Giza and Saqqara that had attracted little attention despite obvious signs of ancient construction. What he uncovered was extraordinary. The pit descended deep into bedrock, lined with precisely fitted limestone blocks that had been interlocked in complex patterns requiring significant effort to disassemble. At the bottom sat granite blocks, some weighing upwards of 70 tons, along with a mysterious circular granite coffer that showed no obvious purpose. The coffer was empty except for a dark residue coating its interior, raising questions about what it might once have contained. Barsanti documented his findings, took photographs that still exist in archives, and published preliminary reports describing the scale and precision of the work. The site clearly represented significant Old Kingdom construction, possibly another pyramid complex that had never been completed or had been dismantled in antiquity. The granite work was exceptional, showing the same kinds of precision visible at Giza and Saqqara. The circular coffer was unique, unlike anything found at other sites, suggesting purposes beyond simple burial. Zawiet El Arian seemed poised to provide important insights into Old Kingdom building methods and perhaps challenge some assumptions about pyramid construction. In 1955, Hollywood came to Zawiet El Arian. The film Land of the Pharaohs needed locations that looked appropriately ancient and mysterious, and the Great Pit provided perfect scenery. Footage from the film shows the pit in remarkable condition, the limestone blocks still in place, the massive granite elements visible at the bottom, the whole site looking much as Barsanti had left it half a century earlier. The production used the real archaeological site as a backdrop for fictional drama about pyramid building and royal burial, never imagining they were documenting the last time this evidence would be accessible to anyone. Shortly after filming wrapped, the Egyptian military claimed the land. Zawiet El Arian sat in a strategically useful location, and the army needed the space for their purposes. The archaeological site became a military zone, off limits to researchers, closed to the public, effectively erased from the accessible record of Egyptian antiquity. What happened next is visible on satellite images available through Google Earth. The great pit that Barsanti had excavated that represented potentially crucial evidence about ancient technological capabilities became a garbage dump. The military used it as a convenient hole to fill with refuse. Tons of trash were dumped into the pit, burying the limestone blocks covering the massive granite elements, making the whole site inaccessible even if permission to excavate was somehow granted. The message is clear even if unintentional. Evidence that complicates the timeline gets buried one way or another. This physical burial at Zawiat el-Arian represents the most extreme example of a broader pattern. For decades, access to Egypt's most important sites has been tightly controlled through permit systems, official gatekeepers, and bureaucratic structures that determine who can research what and which questions are worth investigating. Research proposals that might challenge the established timeline face particular obstacles. Geologist Robert Schoch wanted to conduct detailed analysis of water erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure after his initial survey in the early 1990s suggested the weathering indicated exposure to significant rainfall. His geological analysis pointed toward a much older date for the Sphinx, potentially predating dynastic Egypt entirely. Follow-up permits to continue this research were denied. The geological evidence remains visible to anyone who visits the site. The weathering patterns don't change, but systematic scientific investigation of what that weathering implies has been blocked for decades. The Osiris shaft beneath the Giza plateau presents another case of restricted access. This multi-level underground structure contains chambers descending through solid bedrock with granite sarcophagi positioned in flooded lower levels. The construction required significant engineering to create and would provide important information about underground building techniques and the relationship between surface monuments and subsurface structures. The shaft was explored in the 1990s, photographed, documented, and then closed. Access has been denied to researchers ever since, despite numerous requests from archaeologists and engineers who want to conduct detailed surveys using modern technology. The official explanation involves preservation concerns and structural stability, but the effect is that evidence remains inaccessible. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Giza over the years have detected anomalies suggesting chambers and passages beneath the plateau that conventional theory doesn't account for. These surveys were performed with official permission. The results indicated interesting features worth investigating, and then follow-up excavation to verify the findings was denied or indefinitely delayed. The data exists. Researchers know approximately where these underground features are located, but actually excavating to confirm their existence and understand their nature remains prohibited. Even when exploration is permitted, it sometimes stops at crucial moments. Robotic exploration of the shafts in the Great Pyramid discovered a sealed door with copper fittings at the end of one passage. The technology existed to open this door carefully, to see what lay beyond, to potentially answer questions about the pyramid's internal structure and purpose. The exploration was halted. Years passed. Eventually, a different team was allowed to drill through the door, only to find another door behind it. That second door has never been opened, despite the fact that the technology to do so without damage has existed for decades. The pyramid keeps its secrets not because we lack the means to investigate, but because investigation keeps being stopped just before it might reveal something significant. This pattern of blocked research doesn't only operate through direct denial of permits. It works through academic channels that determine which projects receive funding, which papers get published, which researchers advance in their careers. Propose a project assuming the conventional timeline and funding flows readily. Propose one that might challenge orthodox chronology, and funding committees find reasons to reject it. Submit a paper presenting evidence that fits accepted frameworks and journals. Publish it after normal peer review. Submit one questioning fundamental assumptions about Egyptian chronology, and it faces reviewer hostility, demands for impossible levels of proof, and ultimate rejection regardless of the quality of evidence presented. The reasons for this defensive posture become clear when you consider what's actually at stake. Egypt's tourism industry generates billions of dollars annually, much of it flowing from visitors drawn by the pyramids and the romantic narrative of ancient pharaohs building eternal monuments. That narrative requires simple, comprehensible stories tourists can absorb during brief visits. Khufu built the Great Pyramid. Khafra carved the Sphinx. The Old Kingdom was when all this happened. Complicate that narrative with questions about older dates, unknown builders, or inherited structures, and you risk confusing tourists and potentially damaging the economic engine tourism represents. Beyond economics, there are questions of national identity and cultural heritage. Modern Egypt has built significant aspects of its national identity around the achievements of ancient Egypt, claiming connection to and pride in the civilization that created the pyramids. And that connection depends on clear attribution, on knowing which pharaohs accomplished what, on having a timeline that makes ancient Egypt's achievements fit within a comprehensible historical framework. It's not just about historical accuracy, it's about national mythology and the stories cultures tell themselves about their origins and greatness. There's also the broader narrative of human civilization's development that depends on keeping Egyptian chronology within certain boundaries. The progression from simple hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural villages to early cities to complex civilizations with monumental architecture follows a neat timeline in standard historical accounts. This progression makes sense, feels logical, explains how humanity developed from primitive origins to advanced societies through gradual accumulation of knowledge and capabilities. Egypt fits into this framework as one of the earliest complex civilizations after agriculture had been established in the region for a few thousand years. Everything proceeds in order with no major anomalies, but if the pyramids and other megalithic structures are significantly older, then the whole framework needs reconsideration, not just for Egypt, but for our understanding of when and how human civilization developed. What capabilities existed in deep prehistory, what might have been lost during cataclysmic events like the Younger Dryas. These questions extend far beyond Egyptology into fundamental assumptions about human history, and those assumptions support enormous amounts of scholarship across multiple disciplines. Protecting the Egyptian timeline isn't just about defending particular dates for particular monuments. It's about maintaining a much larger structure of historical understanding that would require extensive revision if the Egyptian foundations turned out to be wrong. So the timeline gets protected through mechanisms both direct and subtle. Problematic sites become garbage dumps or military zones. Interesting findings get denied follow-up investigation. The boundaries stay firmly in place. But despite all these defensive mechanisms, despite the institutional weight, defending the conventional timeline, the evidence itself hasn't changed. The contradictions remain. The impossible mathematics don't resolve. The patterns of sophisticated work underlying cruder additions persist at site after site. And the ancient Egyptians' own words, their careful records of deep history, stretching back tens of thousands of years, still exist in the very documents modern scholars simultaneously cite as historical sources and dismiss as mythology. Perhaps it's time to consider the possibility that the Egyptians knew their own history better than modern academics have given them credit for.